Imagine being 13,000 feet up in a frozen hell, surrounded by the mangled metal of a crashed plane and the bodies of your friends. The air is so thin it burns your lungs, and the snow stretches out forever in every direction. Rescue isn't coming. Days turn into weeks, and your hunger becomes a physical pain, a screaming monster in your stomach. You have one choice. To live, you must do the unthinkable. This is the story of Uruguayan Air Force Flight 571, a team of young, vibrant rugby players, their family, and friends, who went from a simple flight to a desperate, 72-day nightmare in the heart of the Andes Mountains. It's a tale of impossible survival, extraordinary faith, and the terrible price they had to pay to see the sun rise again. Get ready, because this is the miracle of the Andes. It was Friday, October 13th, 1972. You can't make up a date like that, can you? For the young men of the Old Christians Club rugby team from Montevideo, Uruguay, it was supposed to be the trip of a lifetime. Not just the players, but a whole group of their friends, family members, and supporters were packed onto a twin-engine Fairchild F-27 chartered flight. Their destination was Santiago, Chile, where they were scheduled to play a match. They were young, most of them in their late teens and early 20s, full of life, confidence, and the kind of easy optimism that only comes with youth. They were going to cross the mighty Andes, the biggest mountain range outside of Asia, and then they were going to play a rugby match. It was a simple, exciting plan. The plane took off from Carrasco International Airport in Uruguay on Thursday, October 12th. The Andes are huge, and the planes of the day couldn't fly directly over the highest peaks with a full load, so they had to make a stopover. The first leg of the journey was to Mendoza, Argentina, on the eastern side of the mountains. That night, they stayed in Mendoza, enjoying the hospitality and the simple comfort of a warm bed, completely unaware that this would be the last truly easy night for many of them. The next morning, Friday the 13th, the weather was bad. The mountains were shrouded in cloud, and visibility was poor. Many pilots would have waited, but the team was eager to get to Santiago. The Fairchild, a turboprop plane, wasn't exactly a high-tech wonder, but it was sturdy. The pilot, Colonel Julio Ferradas, had flown this route many times before, but even experienced pilots make mistakes, and the Andes are notoriously tricky. As the plane climbed, it entered the thick, gray soup of the clouds. Inside the cabin, the mood was still lighthearted, with joking and laughter. They were flying on instruments, relying on calculations and assumptions about their position. The captain contacted air traffic control and, believing they had already passed Curacao, Chile, the designated turning point, requested permission to descend. This was the critical error. They were not over Curacao. They were still deep within the mountain range, flying directly toward some of the tallest, deadliest peaks. The controller, having no reason to doubt the pilot's position report, cleared the plane for descent. This was the moment fate sealed their doom. The plane dropped out of the safe cruising altitude and into the path of the jagged, unseen mountains. The fun was about to end. The descent was rough. The turbulence was jarring, and the light-hearted atmosphere inside the plane vanished, replaced by nervous apprehension. One moment, they were sharing a joke. The next, the plane was being violently tossed around. Then came the sound, a terrifying, earth-shaking, metal-on-rock screech that no one who heard it would ever forget. It was like a monstrous hand had reached up and simply ripped the plane apart. The first impact was the plane's right wing shearing off against a mountain peak. The wing was carrying the fuel, and as it detached, it snapped back, tearing into the rear of the fuselage. The force was so immense that the tail section, complete with the bathroom and galley, was completely ripped away. The plane was instantly reduced to a hollow, speeding tube carrying its terrified cargo. Inside the remaining fuselage, chaos erupted. Luggage, seats, and people were thrown around like dolls. Many died instantly, either from the impact with the mountain or from being sucked out of the gaping hole where the tail used to be. The fuselage, now acting like a gigantic, metal toboggan, slid down the side of the glacier at breakneck speed. It was a terrifying, uncontrolled slide, and then, mercifully, it came to a grinding, final halt in a vast, snow-filled basin. When the violent motion stopped, an overwhelming silence descended. The blizzard had ceased, and the only sound was the howling of the wind and the pained, ragged breathing of the survivors. Out of the 45 people who had boarded the plane, 12 were killed immediately in the initial crash. A few others died shortly afterward. When the initial shock wore off, the survivors, 28 of them, began to take stock. The scene was horrific. Blood stained the pristine white snow, and the air temperature was plummeting rapidly as the sun began to set. They were trapped inside the mangled shell of the plane, which was now their only shelter. The front of the fuselage was still intact, but the cockpit had been smashed, killing the pilots. It was cold beyond imagination, and they were surrounded by the dead. The young men, minutes ago carefree athletes, were now accidental doctors, nurses, and undertakers. They used what was left of the seats and clothing to plug the holes in the fuselage to try and keep the freezing wind out. The nightmare had begun, and the world had no idea where they were. The immediate aftermath was a blur of triage and shock. Nando Pardu, one of the most athletic of the group, had suffered a massive blow to the head and was initially thought to be dead, lying comatose next to the body of his mother. His younger sister, Susie, was also severely injured. Roberto Canessa, a 19-year-old medical student, immediately stepped up, his textbook knowledge suddenly being put to the most desperate test. He worked with Gustavo Zerbino, another medical student, to tend to the broken limbs, concussions, and deep lacerations. They used shredded clothing as bandages and tried to keep the injured warm. The priority was simply survival for the next hour. With daylight fading, the survivors took a desperate inventory. What had they salvaged from the wreck? Not much. A few small suitcases, a scattered handful of candy bars, some bottles of wine, and a transistor radio. Crucially, they had no warm clothing. They were dressed for a quick flight to a sunny city, not for the high-altitude, sub-zero hell of the Andes. Their location was a snow-covered, glacial valley, later identified as the Valley of Tears, at an altitude of approximately 11,700 feet. The temperature would drop to well below $0 F dollar at night. The plane's fuselage became their fragile home. They packed themselves in tightly, using the dead bodies of their friends and family as a ghastly, improvised wall to seal off the broken rear section. They used the seat covers as blankets, but they offered little protection against the brutal cold. The first nights were pure misery. The cold was a constant, physical agony that robbed them of sleep and hope. They tried to melt snow for water, a difficult process that used up precious energy. The injured began to succumb. By the 8th day, 5 more had died. Among the new dead was Nando Paredo's sister, Susie. Nando, who had miraculously woken from his coma, now faced the crushing reality of his mother and sister being gone, a raw grief that would later fuel his incredible will to live. Their meager food supply was rationed to minuscule amounts, a tiny square of chocolate or a single raisin once a day. They knew the food wouldn't last. Every day, the radio, held by the older members, became their focus. They prayed for news of rescue, a search plane, anything. But the snow-capped mountains provided a perfect, cruel camouflage. The transistor radio was the survivors' only link to the outside world, a tiny plastic oracle that held the key to their hope. Every day, usually around sunset when the batteries were strongest, they gathered around the small device, shivering inside the fuselage, the air thick with anticipation. The silence of the mountains was broken only by the crackle of static until they could tune into a clear signal from Argentina or Chile. They clung to every word, searching for mention of Uruguayan Air Force Flight 571. For over a week, the news was full of their disappearance. They heard about the massive international search efforts, the planes crisscrossing the towering peaks, and the growing concern from their families. This news, despite the hardship, provided a sliver of hope. The world knew they were missing, and the world was looking for them. However, as the days dragged on, the tone of the reports began to change. The search area was huge, the mountains immense, and the wreckage was perfectly camouflaged against the white snow. The search efforts were hampered by poor visibility and the sheer scale of the Andes. Then, on the 10th day after the crash, October 23rd, the news came that crushed their spirits more brutally than the crash itself. While listening intently, they heard the voice of a newscaster reporting the inevitable conclusion. After 10 grueling days of searching, and with no signs of the aircraft, the official search operation for the missing plane and its passengers had been called off. They were presumed dead. The news hit them like a physical blow. Roberto Canessa, the young medical student, was holding the radio. He heard the words, "All search efforts have been suspended," and repeated them to the others, his voice breaking. The realization was stark and absolute. They were not missing. They were abandoned. The world had given up on them. No one was coming. They were utterly alone, deep in the mountains, facing a future where every moment was a struggle against the elements and starvation. The initial despair was profound and immediate. Some wept, some turned inward, others simply stared blankly at the hole in the ceiling of the fuselage. The psychological impact of being declared dead was almost as devastating as the physical reality of their situation. This moment became the true beginning of their impossible journey, the point where survival stopped being about waiting for rescue and started being about taking control of their own fate. They were now in a silent war for their lives. With the official end of the search, the survivors were forced to confront the grim reality of their meager provisions. For nearly 2 weeks, they had subsisted on tiny, painful rations. The initial excitement over finding a few bottles of wine and a small box of chocolates had long faded. Now, the hunger was no longer a dull ache. It was a consuming, debilitating force. Their bodies were burning through their fat reserves, and the high-altitude cold accelerated the caloric drain. They tried eating parts of the plane's upholstery, small strips of cotton and straw, but it provided no nutrition and only made them sick. They were literally wasting away. The medical students, especially Roberto Canessa, understood the science of what was happening. They calculated that without protein and calories, their remaining time was measured in days, maybe weeks at best. They were facing a slow, certain death by starvation. The topic that began to bubble up, first in hushed, nervous whispers, then in more direct, painful conversations, was the ultimate taboo. It was the question of how to get the sustenance they needed when their surroundings offered nothing but rock and ice. They looked around at the bodies of their deceased friends and family, perfectly preserved in the glacial ice. This was not a decision anyone took lightly. They were deeply religious, mostly Catholic, and the idea of cannibalism, of consuming human flesh, was an absolute violation of everything they believed. Yet, the brutal, simple logic of survival was overriding everything. As the hunger pangs grew sharper, the distinction between life and death blurred. Canessa and others argued that the bodies were merely physical matter, a shell that the spirit had already left. They invoked the ultimate sacrifice, drawing parallels to the Christian communion, the body of Christ. They framed it not as an act of disrespect, but as an act of love and necessity, a way to keep the promise of life to those who were still breathing. The debate was agonizing, fraught with tears, fear, and revulsion. Many were adamantly against it, but the increasing weakness of their bodies was a powerful, silent argument. The debate lasted several harrowing days. Finally, with the realization that they would not last another week without protein, the agonizing decision was made. The living would feed on the dead to survive. The decision had been made, but the implementation was a hurdle of unimaginable psychological difficulty. This was the moment when theory met the gruesome, painful reality. The task required a strength of will that few possess, and it was primarily the medical students, Canessa and Zerbino, who took on the horrific responsibility. They chose a body from one of the victims who had died in the initial crash, a person they did not know well, as a way to manage the immediate, overwhelming emotional barrier. The bodies had been stored outside, preserved in the deep freeze of the glacier. Using a piece of broken glass or metal salvage from the wreckage, a crude, inadequate tool, Canessa made the first cut. He later described the act as one of the most difficult things he had ever done, requiring him to shut down every instinct, every moral teaching he had ever received. The flesh was frozen solid, making the process slow, agonizing, and almost impossible with their blunt instruments. It was an act of surgical precision mixed with primal, desperate necessity. Once the small pieces were separated, the next and greatest hurdle was actually ingesting them. The first few survivors who tried felt an immediate, violent surge of nausea and revulsion. The psychological barrier was immense. The act was repugnant, shocking to the human conscience. Many tried and failed, gagging and throwing up the meager sustenance. But the body's desperate need for energy was a relentless, overriding demand. Nando Pardue, whose grief had hardened into an absolute resolve to live, was one of the first to overcome the nausea. He recognized that this was the only path forward. Slowly, painfully, one by one, the survivors forced themselves to accept the terrible sacrifice. They understood that every single piece they consumed was a step away from death, a continuation of their beating hearts. It was a shared, silent, and profound horror, but with every agonizing, forced swallow, they found a grim, renewed determination. They were now survivors in the truest, most desperate sense, fueled by the dead, committed to the life they still held. The taboo was broken, and the long, chilling wait for rescue continued. Survival on the glacier settled into a grim routine. The day was divided between melting snow for water, conserving energy, and the deeply painful task of preparing and consuming their food. Nando Pardue, having channeled his grief into iron willpower, became a source of strength, constantly urging his fellow survivors to maintain hope and work toward escape. Roberto Canessa remained the crucial medical anchor, tending to their persistent injuries and the sheer physical toll of the cold. The group had developed a structure, a necessary hierarchy for survival, led by the older, more experienced members like Marcelo Perez del Castillo, the captain of the rugby team. 18 days after the crash, just as they began to adjust to the horrifying routine, the mountain delivered another catastrophic blow. It was the night of October 29th. The survivors were huddled together inside the fuselage, attempting to sleep in the suffocating closeness that was their only defense against the sub-zero temperatures. Outside, a terrible blizzard had raged for hours, dumping massive amounts of snow. Then, without warning, a massive, deep rumble shook the earth. It was an avalanche. Tons upon tons of snow, dislodged from the peak above, roared down the mountain and slammed into the fuselage with devastating force. The snow burst through the fragile openings in the plane, instantly filling the cabin. The survivors were buried alive. It was a terrifying, suffocating rush of cold, heavy powder. They couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Panic set in as they realized they were trapped in a frozen tomb. Using sheer, desperate strength, some of the younger men, like Pardue and Canessa, managed to claw their way through the packed snow. They struggled to find pockets of air and began digging frantically for their buried companions. The fuselage was completely submerged, and the effort to clear the snow was monumental in the thin, freezing air. Tragically, 8 more people were killed instantly, either by the weight of the snow or by suffocation. Marcelo Perez del Castillo, the team captain and one of the group's initial leaders, was among the dead. The avalanche was a brutal reminder that the Andes were not just cold, they were actively trying to kill them. The number of survivors was now reduced to 19. The avalanche was a moment of profound crisis. It had destroyed the fuselage's already fragile structure, killed their leader, and left them even more demoralized and exposed. However, in a strange twist of fate, the tragedy also served as a horrific reset. With the loss of several key figures, Nando Pardue and Roberto Canessa, along with Fido Strauch, emerged as the new, undisputed core of leadership. The death of their friends brought a new, fierce clarity. They could not simply wait to be rescued, nor could they afford to die waiting. They were completely on their own, and the only way out was to walk out. The group spent the next few days digging out the fuselage and securing what remained. They realized that their primary problem, aside from food, was the altitude. They were too high, and the planes searching for them, when they were searching, were likely flying much lower in the valleys. Their only chance was to reach the western side of the mountains, which led to Chile and civilization. This meant an expedition. The sheer scale of the Andes was terrifying, but the alternative, dying slowly in the snow, was worse. The decision was made to prepare an expedition team. Nando Pardue, who was driven by a powerful, singular focus, was the obvious choice to lead the physical effort. Canessa, despite his youth, possessed the scientific knowledge and the sheer determination. They began the agonizing process of strengthening their weakened bodies with the only sustenance available. They knew they couldn't just walk out in the clothing they had. They needed warm gear, but they had none. The ingenuity born of desperation kicked in. Fido Strauch, a natural mechanic and designer, began the laborious process of creating better insulation and equipment. They used the heavy nylon covering from the aircraft's windows and seat cushions to sew crude, multi-layered sleeping bags and better protection for their feet. Every piece of equipment, from the boots they salvaged to the improvised blankets, was a monumental effort, a testament to their absolute will to survive. The expedition would be their final, desperate roll of the dice. The preparations for the journey were meticulously slow. They needed to know which direction to go, and they needed to be sure they could physically withstand the trek. The first attempts to scout the surrounding area were disheartening. Every direction looked the same: blinding white snow, jagged peaks, and nothing but the vast, cold emptiness of the Andes. Several small parties tried to climb the highest ridge near the crash site, believing that if they could see the other side, they would see the green valleys of Chile. The thin air and the physical exertion made the climbs brutal, but each failed attempt brought back crucial information. The biggest discovery was made when they salvaged the batteries from the plane's wreck. They thought if they could power the radio transmitter, they could signal a plane. They spent days dragging the heavy batteries to the fuselage, an almost impossible feat in the altitude. Tragically, they discovered that even with the batteries, the transmitter was too weak to send a signal the necessary hundreds of miles to the distant cities. The radio was only useful for receiving. This failure cemented the reality: they had to walk. The plan was solidified. Nando Pardu and Roberto Canessa, the two strongest and most driven of the group, would be the primary trekkers. They would be accompanied by Antonio "Tintin" Vizintin, who was also incredibly fit. Their goal was clear: climb the massive peak to the west, which Pardu had now scaled multiple times in scouting attempts, and then walk until they reached Chile. They packed their improvised gear: a small amount of the processed meat, the sewn sleeping bags, and a pair of sunglasses to prevent snow blindness. The other survivors agreed to wait, conserving their resources, praying that the expedition team would return with help. The three men knew that they were not just walking for themselves. They were carrying the lives of the remaining 16 people on their shoulders. On December 12th, exactly 2 months after the crash, Pardu, Canessa, and Vizintin put on their crude boots and began their final, monumental climb out of the Valley of Tears. The beginning of the expedition was a brutal physical trial. Nando Pardu, Roberto Canessa, and Antonio Vizintin faced an immediate, towering obstacle: the massive, nameless peak that overshadowed the crash site. Nando, fueled by an almost maniacal focus, insisted that this was the ridge separating them from the fertile lands of Chile. He had attempted the climb several times, only to be turned back by exhaustion or the sheer scale of the mountain. But this time was different. They were prepared, equipped with their cobbled-together gear, and motivated by the knowledge that this was their absolute last chance. The first day was a slow, agonizing slog. The mountain was relentless. Every step was a battle against the thin air, which left their lungs burning and their heads throbbing. The snow was deep and unpredictable, sometimes crusty and supportive, sometimes soft and sinking, forcing them to expend enormous amounts of energy. Their improvised snowshoes and boots were clumsy and offered little comfort. They had sewn a massive, insulating sleeping bag using salvaged materials from the plane, which proved to be a lifesaver during the nights. The three men had to sleep crammed together inside this cocoon, relying on shared body heat to ward off the deadly cold. By the second day, they had reached a significant altitude. The landscape was breathtakingly beautiful, but its grandeur was overshadowed by the deadly peril it represented. They were focused entirely on the immediate task, putting one foot in front of the other. Tintin Vizintin, although strong, was struggling the most with the altitude and exhaustion. Nando, drawing on reserves of strength he didn't know he possessed, took the lead, cutting steps into the ice. His single-minded determination drove the pace. Canessa, though often slower and more thoughtful, provided the necessary caution and scientific insight. They knew that a wrong step, a moment of weakness, could mean a fall to their deaths. As they finally approached the crest of the ridge, the sun began to set, casting long, menacing shadows across the endless snowscape. They held their breath, praying that the other side would finally reveal the promise of civilization. On the third day of the trek, Nando Pardu, pushing himself to the absolute limits of his endurance, finally hauled himself over the final ridge of the giant peak. He paused, his chest heaving, expecting to see a welcoming vista of green valleys, rivers, and signs of human life. Chile. Instead, he was met with a sight that was utterly crushing. As he looked west, the view was not of rolling green hills, but of more mountains. Huge, unforgiving peaks stretched out as far as the eye could see, a dizzying, terrifying ocean of white and rock. The mountain they had just climbed was merely a shoulder of the main range, and the Andes continued their icy reign far beyond. This was the moment of ultimate despair. They had sacrificed everything, endured untold suffering, and climbed for 3 days only to discover they were still completely surrounded by the wilderness. The distance to safety felt infinite. Tintin and Canessa reached the summit shortly after and saw the same horrifying view. The silence between the three men was profound, broken only by the wind. They had hoped to see freedom. They saw only a confirmation of their insignificance. It was here, in this moment of devastating realization, that Nando Pardu made his most famous decision. He realized that the mountain range was not a wall, but a journey. His mindset shifted from waiting to be rescued to becoming the rescuer. He looked at the endless peaks and decided they were not obstacles, but merely milestones. He stated simply that they were going to keep walking until they died, or until they found people. They had come this far. There was no turning back. Recognizing that Tintin was struggling and that bringing him along would slow them down and consume precious food, they made the difficult decision to send him back. They stripped him of his share of the food, gave him directions, and sent him back to the fuselage. Now, only two were left, Nando Pardu and Roberto Canessa. With a final, agonizing gulp of thin air, the two men began their descent into the unknown valley, facing a mountain range they now knew was far wider and more dangerous than they had ever imagined. The final, two-man trek began in earnest. Pardu and Canessa descended the western slope, their bodies weak but their minds driven by the knowledge that every day they walked, the odds of survival increased, however marginally. They adopted a relentless, steady pace. Pardu, strong and physically resilient, focused on navigation and breaking the trail. Canessa, sometimes moody and often deeply burdened by the moral weight of their survival, focused on conserving their energy and assessing their physical limits. The journey was a constant, grueling test of their partnership. Their biggest enemy was not just the cold, but the monotonous, unchanging terrain. They walked for days, descending slightly, yet still encountering treacherous ice and snowfields. Their improvised sleeping bag continued to be their most vital piece of equipment, allowing them to survive the brutal nights. During the day, they used pieces of their salvaged clothing to shield their faces from the sun's glare reflecting off the snow, preventing snow blindness, which was a constant threat. Their food was running critically low. They had portioned their supply, the small, frozen strips of protein, into the bare minimum required to maintain function. They knew they could not afford to stop. They followed a riverbed, betting that water flows lead to life. After days of walking, they finally noticed a subtle shift in the landscape. The snow became patchier, giving way to rock, and eventually, after almost 10 full days of walking since leaving the crash site, they saw something that made their hearts leap: a patch of green grass. The line of permanent snow had finally been breached. A small, stunted bush was the first sign of life they had seen in 66 days. The sight was so overwhelming that they stopped and wept. They were still far from help, but the physical environment had changed, offering them the possibility of a different kind of survival. The mountains were finally beginning to release them. Walking through the grass felt like walking on a cloud. The sensation of earth and living vegetation beneath their feet was an almost psychedelic experience after 2 months of nothing but ice and snow. Pardu and Canessa knew they were still in a remote valley, but the presence of life signaled that they were getting closer to civilization. They continued to follow the river downstream, which was now a rushing torrent of glacial meltwater. The journey became less about scaling peaks and more about navigating rough, rocky terrain and dense bushes, which tore at their already fragile clothing. On the 10th day of their trek, December 20th, a profound sign of hope appeared: a small herd of cows grazing on the riverbank. This simple sight was confirmation that people were nearby. Where there were domesticated animals, there had to be ranchers or farms. The two men, utterly emaciated, sun-scorched, and wearing tattered, improvised gear, rushed forward, but the cows scattered in fear. They were nearing the absolute limit of their strength. They hadn't eaten proper food in 70 days, and the physical effort of the trek had been enormous. They continued down the river, their every step now driven by a desperate, feverish hope. That evening, they stopped beside the riverbank, too exhausted to continue. Nando spotted something on the far side of the rushing water, a man on horseback, wearing a dark poncho and riding a mule. Pardu and Canessa began yelling, but the noise of the rushing river drowned them out. The man, a Chilean hueso, cowboy, saw them but couldn't understand their frantic gestures. They looked like ghosts, and the man was suspicious. He eventually rode off, but not before Pardu and Canessa had spotted something incredible. On the riverbank near where the cowboy had been standing, they saw a small, makeshift fire pit and a pile of stones. This wasn't the wilderness anymore. This was a place where people lived and worked. They had to cross the river. The river was too fast and cold to cross that night. Pardu and Canessa spent a torturous night freezing on the bank, watching the other side, unable to communicate with the civilization that was now tantalizingly close. The next morning, December 21st, the cowboy returned. He was riding on the far side of the river, still cautious. The sight of the two men, skeletal, bearded, and dressed in rags, was deeply disturbing to the rancher, who later identified himself as Sergio Catalan. Pardu, driven by pure necessity, began frantically pointing to his mouth, then to the sky, trying to convey that they were victims of a plane crash. Catalan still could not hear them over the river's roar. Finally, the rancher threw a piece of paper and a pencil, wrapping them around a stone, and tossed them across the water. It was a lifeline. Nando Pardu grabbed the paper and, with shaking hands, wrote the incredible message in Spanish. "We come from a plane that fell in the mountains. We are 14 people who are still alive. We need help. We can't walk anymore. Where are we?" He wrote their location and begged for assistance, signing it with the names of the survivors. Pardu wrapped the note around the stone and hurled it back across the fast current. Sergio Catalan picked up the note. As he read the astonishing message, the reality hit him. These were the missing rugby players the world had given up for dead 2 months earlier. He immediately grasped the urgency. He pointed up the river, indicating that he would ride for help, and then rode off on his mule on a grueling, 10-hour journey to the nearest police station in the village of Puente Negro. That note, scrawled on a scrap of paper, was the first official word the world had received from the survivors of Flight 571 in 70 days. The waiting was finally over. The rescue machinery of Chile was instantly activated. The next day, December 22nd, was a whirlwind of activity. The Chilean Air Force organized a massive rescue operation. 2 helicopters, guided by Sergio Catalan and Nando Pardu, who insisted on flying back immediately, flew into the mountains. Paredo's return to the crash site, leading the rescuers, was an incredible moment. The remaining 16 survivors were gathered around the fuselage, weak but alive. When the first helicopter landed, the sight of the rescuers and the reality of salvation caused an explosion of emotion. The rescue was complicated. The high altitude and dangerous weather meant that the helicopters could only carry a few people at a time. On the first day, 6 people were airlifted to safety. Nando Pardu and Roberto Canessa were among the first taken to a field hospital. The remaining 10 survivors had to spend one final, terrifying night on the glacier, waiting for the weather to clear. The next morning, December 23rd, the final 10 were brought down. The world was stunned. The news of the miracle of the Andes immediately became the biggest story on the planet. Families who had held funerals for their loved ones were now racing to Chile to reunite with them. But the incredible story of their survival was not yet complete. In the hospital, the survivors, emaciated and suffering from severe dehydration, frostbite, and exhaustion, were forced to tell the full, terrible truth of how they managed to live for 72 days without food. They revealed the agonizing decision they had made to resort to anthropophagy, or cannibalism. The initial public reaction was a mix of awe at their resilience and profound shock and moral judgment. However, after the survivors, with the help of the Catholic Church, explained their decision as an ultimate act of love and necessity, a choice between life and death, the world largely accepted the grim truth. They were not just survivors. They were heroes who had faced the absolute limit of human endurance and moral decision-making. 72 days. 72 days of unimaginable cold, hunger, and absolute isolation. These young men, rugby players and students, were forced to make the most horrifying choice imaginable just to draw another breath. But their story is not just one of tragedy. It is a profound testament to the unbreakable power of the human spirit. It shows us what we are capable of when all other options are stripped away: the absolute, primal will to live, the power of friendship, and the ingenuity that blossoms from desperation. They walked out of the valley of tears and carried an unbelievable story of sacrifice and survival with them. The question is, what would you do if faced with that impossible choice? Tell us in the comments below. If this incredible true story moved you, please hit the like button, subscribe for more epic survival tales, and share your thoughts. We'll see you in the next one.